GSP is one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. He was competing at the highest level from 2004 all the way to 2017, and as such he's got one of the best resumes in MMA history. However, there can be misconceptions about GSP's resume from UFC fans, so I've figured out a more conclusive way to determine how good GSP's resume is. Just for reference to clarify the criteria for how good a record is, every opponent GSP has fought in the UFC will be sorted into a category, from S tier to D tier, very similar to the boxing equivalent criteria that I've made. S tier is reserved for all-time greats, Hall of Famers, people who were top 5 pound for pound at the time. It's very difficult to get a win of that calibre. Then to A+, which is your championship level fighters, people who may be the best or second best in their division. Then you get your A tier fighters who are normally top 3, top 5 in their division. Then your B+ fighters, people who are just outside title contention. Obviously each division's quality will vary. Then B tier, standard contenders. C tier, people who are outside the rankings or very average. Then D tier, there's no one on GSP's record who's in that tier but people who shouldn't really be in the UFC. Guys like Robelis Bisping, Chris Moutinho, Sam Alvey, Mike Jackson, Don'Tale Mayes. We also have to consider the form of the opponents. Were they in their primes or outside their primes? Context surrounding the fight, etc. Anyway, let's begin with GSP's first UFC opponent, Karo Parisyan. If you know Karo Parisyan, you'll know how difficult this is as a first fight. Before the UFC, Parisyan was a judo master. He was 10 wins and 2 losses at the time, and he was 1-0 in the UFC after getting a first round submission. GSP would smush him on the ground on his way to a unanimous decision. But this is one of those wins that ages better in hindsight. Soon after the loss, Parisyan went on to beat Nick Diaz by decision and Matt Serra by decision. Parisyan went on a 4-fight winning streak before finally losing to a prime Diego Sanchez. I don't think Parisyan did quite enough to justify an A tier ranking, but he is close. I'm going to rank him in B+. Next up, GSP took on Jay Heron. Jay Heron never actually won a fight in the UFC. He lost 4 times in the promotion, but he did win some fights in the WEC, Affliction, Strikeforce, including versus Joe Riggs. So I think that's enough to put Heron in the C tier. Then GSP loses his first title fight versus Matt Hughes. I don't believe in putting a loss on a guy's resume. Then GSP takes on Jason Mayhem Miller. Again, Mayhem Miller never actually won a fight in the UFC, but he was decent enough to be a C tier fighter. Then GSP took on Frank Trigg. Not too much to talk about with him. He beat Dennis Hallman twice, the same guy who submitted Matt Hughes before he became champion. He was a decent contender. He goes in B tier. Then GSP took on Sean Shirk, which is quite an underrated win on his record. Especially in hindsight, he went on to beat Nick Diaz, as well as Kenny Florian to become the second UFC lightweight champion in history. Also had a reasonably competitive fight versus Matt Hughes, but he was quite a small welterweight who should have really been in lightweight. And that takes Shirk from being an A+ win to an A tier win. Next up we have the big one, BJ Penn in the first fight. Recent history makes it difficult to see BJ Penn for as good as he was at the time. BJ Penn is one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time. He beat Matt Hughes for the welterweight title, then finished Joe Stevenson and Sean Shirk for the lightweight title. He should have had several welterweight title defences in his UFC career after the Matt Hughes win, but a contract dispute led to him leaving the UFC with the title in 2004. But he did eventually come back to face GSP for a title shot, which GSP would win by split decision. I think BJ Penn's legacy before and after this fight, as well as how competitive this fight itself was, I'm going to put BJ Penn as an S tier win. By far the best on the list so far. Then GSP finally wins the title versus Matt Hughes in the rematch. Again, just to go through Matt Hughes' achievements, he won the title back in 2001 versus Carlos Newton, and defended that title 5 times before losing to BJ Penn in the first fight, but then would go on a 6-fight winning streak, including the first fight with GSP himself and then BJ Penn in the rematch, before ultimately losing to GSP in the rematch. By the time this fight happened, Matt Hughes was very much in good form, the defending champion who just TKO'd BJ Penn. I think Matt Hughes in the rematch is an S tier win. GSP then gets knocked out in the first round by Matt Serra, but then returns to beat up Josh Koscheck. Koscheck was on a good winning streak at that point, coming off a win over Diego Sanchez, but after GSP beat him, the win seems to age quite well, as he went on to beat the likes of Frank Trigg, Anthony Rumble Johnson when he was at 170, and Paul Daly. I think Koscheck is a solid B+ win. He did lose a few fights in between which holds him back from being A tier. He then faces Matt Hughes again in the trilogy for an interim title fight. I don't think it's fair at this point to put Matt Hughes as an S tier win again, considering this was around the time that Hughes really started to slow down, and he got knocked out cold immediately by Thiago Alves afterwards. But I'm not going to put Hughes in the trilogy too far down, I'm going to put him in A tier. Then GSP takes on Matt Serra again for the title. Even though he was champion at the time, he was one of the worst champions in UFC history. He really didn't do much outside that win over GSP, didn't defend the title once in the space of time that GSP fought 2 times. But I do think B tier is a bit harsh, I'm going to say B+. Then he takes on John Fitch for his first title defence. John Fitch was actually on a ridiculous win streak at this point. He won 8 straight wins in the UFC, including versus Thiago Alves and Diego Sanchez, then went on another 5-fight win streak after losing to GSP. I'm going to put John Fitch as an A tier win. GSP then beats BJ Penn again in the rematch. I don't think it was quite a prime BJ Penn at this point, but he was still on very good form. He just knocked out Sean Sherk and then beat up Diego Sanchez for 5 straight rounds. I'm going to put the rematch 1 spot down from the first fight and put him in A+. Then GSP takes on Thiago Alves. Alves was seen at this point as a very dangerous contender. He was on a 7-fight win streak, including the likes of Karo Parisian, Matt Hughes and Josh Koscheck. I'm going to put Alves in the A tier. GSP then takes on Dan Hardy. At this point the UFC was quite desperate for a contender for GSP to face that he hadn't fought already. He was 4-0 in the UFC to get the title shot against the likes of Marcus Davis, Mike Swick, then went on a 3-fight skid after losing to GSP. Hardy was more of a standard contender and he's going to go in the B tier. GSP then takes on Josh Koscheck again. I think Koscheck is in about the same place he was at the first fight, so he goes in B+ again. He then takes on Jake Shields. Similar to John Fitch, Jake Shields was on quite a ridiculous win streak at this point. While it was almost entirely outside the UFC, he had won 13 straight fights in a row, including very respectable names like Paul Daly, Robbie Lawler, Dan Henderson, Jason Miller. I'm going to put Jake Shields in the A tier. Then GSP takes on Carlos Condit. Condit was coming off a very good win over Nick Diaz. I know Diaz fans call that a robbery, but it wasn't. Condit was the former WEC champion, defended that title 3 times before signing to the UFC, where he beat Jake Ellenberger, knocked out Rory McDonald, knocked out Dan Hardy. Then Nick Diaz, like I said before, I think he goes in the A tier. Then GSP takes on Nick Diaz. Diaz was actually coming off a loss at this point, the semi-controversial Condit fight, and he was on a very good win streak up to the Condit fight, being the defending Strikeforce champion. I do think Nick Diaz is a bit overrated, to be honest. He does have decent wins like an older BJ Penn, Paul Daly, Robbie Lawler back in 2004. That big win streak did have quite a few mystery names, guys like Katsuya Inoue, Musin Kobri, Thomas Denny, Mariusz Zaromskis, 80 years old Frank Shamrock. He also had 1 fight after GSP, then got suspended, so I'm only going to put Nick Diaz in the B+ tier. Then GSP takes on Johnny Hendricks in his last title defence. We can argue about whether GSP should have won this fight or not, but to me, unless it's an absolutely clear robbery like Jones versus Reyes, I'm not going to count it as a loss. I personally gave the fight to Hendricks. I gave him round 1, round 2 and round 4. But you can argue either round 1 or 2 for GSP, and for that reason it's not too bad of a robbery. To actually talk about Hendricks himself, obviously Hendricks at that point was fully juiced up. If you look at the record, John Fitch, Josh Koscheck, Carlos Condit, Robbie Lawler, arguably beating GSP himself. Not to mention Hendricks was such a bad matchup for GSP in so many ways. I think when you consider the juice, the record, the fact that he became champion afterwards, I'd say Johnny Hendricks is A+. Then GSP retires, comes back 4 years later to face Michael Bisping, the middleweight champion. I think Michael Bisping as a win by itself is not that good. He's quite similar to Matt Serra in the way that he's one of the worst champions in the UFC. But considering context, he did just knock out Luke Rockhold. Not only had GSP not fought in 4 years, he'd also never fought at middleweight. So that also needs to be taken in consideration. I think if Bisping instead was a better champion like Whittaker or Romero, it'd definitely be an S tier win. But considering it was Bisping and he almost lost to Dan Henderson in his last fight, I'm going to put Bisping as an A+ win, mainly because of the inactivity and a new weight class. Now to finally look at the finished criteria. In the S tier we have BJ Penn in the first fight and Matt Hughes in the second fight. It is very rare to have 2 S tier wins on your record. Then A+ we have the BJ Penn rematch, Michael Bisping and Johnny Hendricks. A tier we have Sean Sherk, Matt Hughes in the trilogy, John Fitch, Thiago Alves, Jake Shields, Carlos Condit. B+ we have Karo Parisian, Matt Serra in the rematch. Both fights versus Koscheck, Nick Diaz, that's going to be controversial. 2 fighters in B tier, Frank Trigg and Dan Hardy, and only 2 in C tier, Jay Hiron and Jason Miller. To overview the losses, Matt Hughes in the first fight is an S tier opponent. Matt Serra in the first fight was only a B+ opponent, but that's why it's one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Then to look at his achievements, 13 title wins, 9 title defences and 2-weight champion. To conclude, it is going to become easier to compare his resume when I make more similar videos. Let me know in the comments. I'll make a John Jones version, Anderson Silva version, Khabib version, Conor McGregor version. That's going to do it for the video. Like and subscribe, leave a comment. Goodbye.